stories. Oh man, she could come out on stage, and she told Uncle Remus stories, and she told stories of growing up, and she's the greatest storyteller I've ever heard. She told stories in the White House. She told stories all over the United States. She told stories all over the world. And here she was, and she in her wheelchair at the door, and I told a story. And people left, and I went down, and she said to Martha Jean, when she kneeled down right here, and I knelt down beside her wheelchair, and she put her hands on my head and one on her shoulder, and she said, "You're just starting, but this is what God wants you to do. Just trust Him and do it." And I said, I have 2 boys in high school now. No, one of them is in high school, the other is junior high. And I want them to go to college, and I've got a job. Not really a lot, but anyway. And she said, no, you're going to have to learn to trust and do. Well, Rob was a freshman in college, and Drew was a senior in high school. And they had a storytelling event in North Carolina. And the boys had jobs, and I took off and drove across by myself to North Carolina and went to that storytelling. And then I drove home, but I told stories, different places, all the way across the South. And I'd get paid. And in Tennessee, also, I had a habit of on Sunday morning, I'd be driving along and I'd come to some little town and people would be going into a church. Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, it didn't matter. I'd pull in the parking lot and go to church. And they always said, you're visiting? I'd say, yes. And they'd say, where are you from? Texas. What are you doing? I went to a storytelling convention. Oh, tell stories to the children. So I got where I had this apple ready to tell a story to the children. Well, this place in Tennessee, I told stories, and then they always said, take you out to lunch. It didn't matter which, it was, that's what it was. Well, this particular group, it was a Baptist church. They took me out to eat, and they asked me to come back that night and talk. And I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. I knew what they wanted, and I said, okay, I'll do it. I'm not ready to go on the road. So I did. And I got home, and the boys had this letter. And they said, Mom, what's this about? You going to China? And I said, what? Give me the letter. The National Storytelling Association would like you to join us in November to go to China and tell stories in schools. So I called them, and they were in Tennessee, and it was this group of people at this Baptist church. I didn't know it was the head of the storytellers. I said, how did you know? And they said, well, we've had people follow you from Tennessee. We got a call from North Carolina because you told stories there. And the people that were working there are all members of the, and they like the story. We like what you're telling. And I said, well, I'm mainly telling Jewish midrash, which are stories of peace and justice and people living together. And they said, well, that's what we need. And we'd like you. And I said, well, okay, I'm a teacher. I'll have to quit teaching, resign. I don't know, and I got a boy in college and another boy's going to college, and they said China will pay half your expenses and we pay the other half for us to start. I said, oh, okay. So I went. And then I came back, and they, every once in a while I would get a call. The first one came from Arkansas, you know. It was like Columbine, a student killing other students.
Mm.
And I went and I told my stories to the children, and then they would break them up in small groups of 3, 4, 5, and they would talk about the story and what they thought the story meant to them and how they could react and how you can't let the anger at the person doing the shooting eat at you. And you have to learn to forgive, and you have to learn to keep going. You can't live your life in fear, and you can't want to go get a gun and take revenge. You can't blame others. Those are hard. So then I got a call to go to Ireland, and you had North Ireland, which is English, and the rest of Ireland, and the Protestants and the Catholics and the hate and so I'd go from one group and then I'd go to another group, and then we managed to get a small group together in Scotland or here in the United States or in Canada that were mixed from both there, and I'd tell the stories. And then I went to Russia. I went to Russia 3 times. I went to Egypt 5 times. I went to Turkey. I went to Syria, Jordan, I was supposed to go to South Africa, but I even had my tickets and everything, but it got canceled because of they had the uprising of because they had the division and all of that. I was supposed to go to Bosnia. That got canceled, and I got to go to Ghana instead, but Bosnia, I never did get to see the Yugoslavian countries because of the war, and that got canceled on me. But I went to Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Poland, Germany, Austria, and it's interesting and it's sad. Austria is a beautiful country, but they've got such dislike of Jewish people, even now. I mean, you go into Poland, it's the same thing. They don't like Jewish people. I saw some amazing sights of the world, and I met very interesting people. And there's a few places I wouldn't want to go back. There are others that I'd go back wouldn't if they asked me.
So where did you get your stories? Was it all from your life, or did you tell like fables and stuff that you'd read, or what?
I only told 2 stories that I read in regular books. One is about a dream, and I changed it. I've told it many times. It's basically, I've managed to trace it back. It's a story that took place, might have been Jesus heard it when he was a boy. You have somebody that lives on one side of a river, and they have a dream. And they're told to go across that river. And there's usually a bridge that they go and stand in the middle of the bridge. And they stand there all day, and they'll be told what to do. So they go and they stand and they keep waiting on somebody to come tell them what to do. And at the end of the day, there's a shopkeeper. They'll come and say, I've seen you stand there all day. Where are you from? And why did you do it? And come have supper with me. And the person says, well, I had this dream that there's treasure. And the shopkeeper just laughs at me. Says, well, I've had a dream that in such and such village there's a treasure underneath the tree, or buried behind the house, or whatever. And I'm not about to leave my shop and go off of it. People don't do that. Well, the person he tells it to goes home and digs under the tree that's in his backyard or his front yard or wherever, and finds the treasure.
Wow.
And it's a story when they dispersed the Jews in 72 AD. The Romans dispersed the Jews, and they went to Europe, and they went to Africa, and they went to India and China, and they took that story with them.
Wow.
And the first time I read it, it was a story that took place in Holland. And then I found it, same story, in another book that was in Ireland, and I found it before I went to China, I found it in a Chinese story. So I used my resources, and we started tracing back.
Wow.
And
That's
I tell it
fantastic.
every once in a while. I tell about the dream. And I tell that one. And then I tell a story. It's Jewish story, but it's 2 brothers that are grown, and they're married, and they live side by side on the property. Each has their own house, and they haven't spoken to each other for years. And the wives talk and the children talk, but the husbands, they don't tell their husbands that they've talked to each other, because they know it'll just make them mad. And a man shows up. And during the night, he takes down the fence they had built between their property. And the 2 men realize in the morning the fence isn't there, and they come storming down. You took it down, you took it down. And this man says, no, God told me to take it down. This is long enough. And they reconcile with each other through the love of God. I tell that every once in a while, especially those two stories are the type of stories that people need to hear.
Yeah. And the rest came from your life?
Hmm?
The rest of the stories came from your own life?
Yeah, they're stories. I don't know. They're stories from my own life. They're stories I've read in books for years and years. But they sometimes I dream them, and I'll wake up and I'll sit in a chair and I'll just wait, and I'll take a Bible or take the Quran or take the Torah. I have these holy books, Buddhist, Confucius, and I'll take them. It's like God is saying, use this one, and I'll find the ending of the story, or I'll, over a period of a week, a month, or something, I'll come up and I'll sit down. I used to sit down at the typewriter, but then the computer, and I'll get it printed out, change it. And then the next thing I know, I'm getting a telephone call. Martha, we need you here, we need you there, and that's a story that I'm telling more than any other.
Wow.
And then I come back and I don't tell it again, unless, I don't know.
How do you tell us a good story?
How
do you tell a good story? What's some keys to telling a good story?
You have to know your audience. You have to be able to project your voice to the very back of the room. You wouldn't believe I could do that, but I could at one time. I could project my voice over to the other side of that yard.
Wow.
Or way back past that trailer, there's a blue car.
Wow.
You know, and I'd look at that person and make sure they could hear. Stories have to have a humor. They have to catch the audience within the first minute and a half. If you haven't got them then, you're not going to get them. And you have to it has to be something that they can take away with them. I mean, if you're talking to school children in China, you get their attention by going in a classroom and rattling off the names of the Rockets basketball team, 3 names, and they're scoring thing. So I'd call the Rockets before I'd go to China, and I'd say, tell me what their average, you know. If I'm going to Japan, I call the Astros, and I'd want the three top Astro baseball and their latest data. So when I went in classroom, and I had their attention right there.
Well, I imagine the humor part is hard because humor across the world is so different, I think.
There are stories you can't tell. I mean, I can go in Texas classroom and tell a story about Poncho, the longhorn steer that led the rest of the cattle all the way up to Wyoming and got left, and he found his way back to Texas in order to eat the hot chilies, Mexican food on the border of Texas. And the kids all know what I'm talking about. But if you go to New York or, you know, or Alabama or Mississippi or, who knows, anyway, Utah even probably, I don't know. You don't tell that story. But you tell it in Texas, you can tell it up here in Wyoming. But they have to know what a longhorn is first. Or a story about an armadillo. You can't. So, Kipling, I don't know if you, anyway, Kipling was a racist, and he was believer in contacting the dead, and he was really a nut in a lot of ways. But he wrote stories that how different animals got their nose or got their the elephant got his long trunk. And when I was elementary librarian, I would tell how the elephant got his long trunk and his curiosity, and the kids would just sit there and they knew what an elephant was and the long trunk and so on. And I'd tell the story about the blind man coming up against the elephant and describing an elephant and saying an elephant is like a snake, or an elephant's like this, a wall, and the kids would identify. But there were stories in Kipling's books that I would try to tell, and it just go flat. I mean, they'd listen to me as respect your elder, you know. So we sit here and we're nice and we're quiet and we listen to the story, but it didn't have the laughter and the response, because the kids didn't know the elephant. I mean the whale, the big whale, and how he got the little throat. That never went over. And there were other stories I would, you know, go into. And
so what is the key to humor?
mm-hmm.
What's the key to humor?
So if you're going to tell a story and have the humor, you've got to be able to know that they know the basic words of what you're saying. And when you're using a translator, I don't speak Chinese or Russian or Spanish even. I mean, so I use translators, and I'd have to make sure that the story that I was doing didn't have any Texas phrases, U.S. phrases in it. And that it was a universal humor in the story. I told a story in China. I told 2 stories at Siam, and it was one of the few times in China I had to have a translator, because Chinese, when you're in kindergarten, you start learning English, so no translator needed. But I got to a university and had this kids who were getting their masters in English to teach, and they obviously didn't need a translator. But then in this university had the board of directors sort of thing, but I had this group of men all in their Red Guard uniform hat that were sitting on one side. They were on a platform, they were sitting up there, and they all spoke Chinese, but they didn't speak English. And they were the communist Red Guard. So I had 2 stories I was going to tell. And one of them was from Africa, and it had universal humor in it. And I thought, I was sitting there, we had dinner, and I was sitting there, and I got up and I thought, I don't know if these old guys are going to like the story or not. And I had this translator, and it was my first trip to China, and my first trip telling. And I thought, I don't know, this might not go over. So I started the story about this girl, and she was very beautiful, and she wiggled her hips, and I wiggled my hips, and I was, strutting on the stage. And so the translator was a woman, and she was standing there, and she translated. And they didn't laugh. And I thought, this isn't going to work. What do I do? So I turned to the translator, and I said, you didn't translate that right. What do you mean I translated it? And everybody, was sitting up and looking, and the men up here, what she said, she didn't translate it. I said, if you translate right, you had to wiggle your hips, you had to wiggle your bust, you had to... And everybody in the room, including the old men, laughed. So, I mean, if they just sat there, I don't know what I would do. But they did, they laughed. And so she was trying to wiggle her hips. She's a little Chinese person. And here I am. But anyway, we got the story told. And then I told him, I'm going to be very serious and tell a real story about my father-in-law. And I said, you don't wiggle your hips in this one. And I said, I asked for a map of Texas, a big map of Texas, to be brought into the room before, when I told her that we were going, but I was told, and that I was going to be one of the speakers. I asked for that map of Texas, and I had brought with me, I'd rolled it up, I had a picture of Dad Hodges that was about so big, it was black and white. And I told him, pointed to the map, and I said he was born right here on a farm. And by the time he was 2, he could read.
Wow.
And he went to school when he was 6 years old, and they put him in the 4th grade. His father was killed when he was 14, and mother took the 3 boys and went to Austin, Texas, and I showed him where Austin was. And when he went to school, they asked people in Austin, said, no way, you can't be this far ahead in school. Come back after school and we'll test you. So he went back, and they put him in a room, and different teachers came in, and they gave him a test in English and history and math. And so he ended up going to the University of Texas when he was 16 years old. And he graduated in chemistry and education. And he became a teacher in this little community right here. And it's a real small community. And they had a 1-room school, and he was the principal, the teacher, the custodian, the whole school. And the kids spoke German, and they were learning English. In 1930, he got a new job down in the valley of Texas. And he taught chemistry in high school. And his English teacher had also graduated from the University of Texas. And they realized that their students graduated, they had to go either to Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas to get a college education. You didn't have anything below San Antonio across Texas college. And the valley needed a college. So these two decided to go around and talk to mayors, churches, Lions clubs, Rotary clubs, all kinds of groups, trying to get interest in getting a college started. And in 1932, they started a junior college in Edinburgh, Texas. And they flipped a coin, and Dad Hodges became the president of the college. And he discovered he didn't like that. You have to deal with the the board of directors and so forth. And he talked his friend, R.P. Ward, to being the president. And he'd be the vice president. He would hire the teachers. And they did that until World War II. And R.P. went to war, and Dad became the president, vice president of the college. And Dad's dream was that the junior college would become a 4-year college. It did. And then it became the University of Texas at Pan America before he died. So it's part of the University of Texas. And kids come from Mexico, and they come from all over Texas to get an education there. Anyway, I finished telling the story of Dad's dream. I said, I called it at that time, I said, he is the real hero of Texas. because he provided education. Well, I finished the story, and there's this silence. And then all this row of men stood up, and the whole room stood up and clapped. And then one of the old men began yakety yakking, and the interpreter said they were very honored to hear the story, and could they please have the photo of Dad Hodges they would paint in the college.
Wow. That's
So
amazing.
next to a picture of Einstein, there's a picture of Dad Hodges in this college in China. Anyway, so I don't know. When I went, I had from July to November to pick out stories. And I sent story ideas back to Tennessee and said, do you think this will go over? Do you think this will go over? And I had approval. And then I had to get approval. They had to send off, I didn't know it at the time, but anyway, they had to get approval from China for the stories. And I ended up with 10. And I would be going in a high school and I'd tell a certain story. I'd go into elementary school and I'd tell a different type of story. And sometimes I'd be sitting there eating and go, what I was going to tell was, now which one of these can I tell?
Wow.
And I didn't tell Dad Hodges' story except one time at that.
Wow. Do you have all these compiled somewhere for your kids? Well, you gotta save them. You've done so much. I think you should. Don't you think that's something you want them?
I told them stories, and
I mean, I would love to have a copy of them. I'm being genuine.
I enjoyed doing it, and it was very exciting.
As a believer, I believe in God, obviously, and I do think that you were inspired, for sure. That's why I think that they should be preserved somewhere.
At the time that Jackie Torrance put her hands on my shoulder, I wasn't sure I believed in God anymore. I had quit going to church. I had actually thought seriously about committing suicide.
Oh, jeez. In 5 years, we lost 7 family members. I found myself in a career that I did not like. I was a librarian, that I had enjoyed that part, but by the time '86 came,
it had changed. It was when I started in the library work, I was telling stories. I loved kindergarten. Come in and I'd tell them stories, and we would talk about reading and books, and we would the importance of learning the words and the joy of reading, and first graders, and I would have kids meet me, and they would say, "Miss Hodges, I read Sam I Am," or, you know, all these, and it was, and they would come, and I'd have